The most respected man in Savannah lied in his last will and testament. He looked God in the eye, so to speak, and he wrote down a lie in his own careful hand. He claimed I was his daughter. I wasn't. And for one terrible year, that lie made the man I loved call me sister. My name is Helen Rowe. I'm 80 years old now, and I live in a quiet house in Charleston with a garden I can no longer kneel in and a memory that has never once let me rest. On my lap tonight, I have two things: a copy of a will written in 1965 and a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Letters I have read so many times the creases have gone soft as cloth. The will imprisoned me. The letters set me free. It took me most of a lifetime to understand the difference between the two men who wrote them, and I want to tell you the whole of it, from the beginning. The way it happened to a girl of 19 who thought the truth was a simple thing. It was not. I was 19 years old in the spring of 1965, a scholarship girl in a modest boarding school on the edge of Savannah, Georgia, when a lawyer I had never met came to collect me. He wore a gray suit and a grave face, and he would not tell me why. He only said a family required my presence, and that arrangements had been made. I remember pressing my forehead to the car window and watching the Spanish moss slide by, certain there had been some mistake. I had no family. My mother had died 2 years before. I had no one at all. That was the first thing I was wrong about. They took me to a funeral. The church was full. Half of Savannah had come to bury Judge Everett Vane, and I stood at the very back in my one good dress, a stranger among people who wore their grief like fine tailoring. I did not know the dead man. I had never spoken his name. But I felt eyes finding me, curious and cold, wondering who the girl at the back could possibly be and why the family lawyer had troubled himself to bring her. One man watched me longer than the rest. I learned later he was Dr. Prescott Cameron, the judge's oldest friend, and one of the two men charged with settling his affairs. He watched me the way you watch a storm cloud that hasn't broken yet. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. Doctor. Cameron had spent his life beside Everett Vane, and some instinct told him that his friend had left one last thing undone, one secret set to open only after the earth had closed over him. He was right about that too. The will was read the next morning in a law office that smelled of leather and cigar smoke, and I was made to sit in the corner while the family arranged itself in the good chairs. The judge's sister, Cordelia Vane, a thin woman of 58, who had run that household since the day her brother's wife died, sat with her spine like a fireplace poker. Beside her sat the judge's son, Stephen Vane. 24 years old, dark-haired, still and pale with mourning, and so beautiful in his sorrow that I looked away, ashamed to be looking at all. The lawyer read the ordinary things first: the house, the investments, the bequests to the church and the servants. And then he came to a paragraph that changed the air in the room. "To Helen Rowe," he read, "born of a union I kept in silence all my life, I acknowledge her before God and the law as my daughter." I did not move. I could not. Cordelia made a sound like a door slamming somewhere far off in the house. Dr. Cameron came half out of his chair. And Stephen? Stephen turned and looked at me across that room with an expression I have spent 60 years trying to forget. A look of a young man who has just been told that the stranger in the corner is his own blood. The will went on. The judge instructed his son to bring me into the family home, to give me a daughter's place under that roof, and to treat me. The lawyer read the words slowly. "With the tenderness a brother owes a sister." And he tied the hands of everyone in that room with money, as men like him always could, making each person's inheritance depend on the kindness they showed me. Cordelia protested. Dr. Cameron protested louder, but Stephen, who had loved his father past all reason, only bowed his head and said, "It was his last wish. We will honor it." And so it was decided. I would leave the school. I would live in the house of a dead man who had claimed me as his own. There was only one problem, and I was the only living soul who knew it. Everett Vane was not my father. If a single sheet of paper has ever turned your whole life upside down, then stay with me tonight. Because that will was only the first lie, and it was not even the cruelest one. The Vane house stood in the old part of Savannah, behind a wrought iron gate and a wall of magnolias that dropped their white blossoms on the brick like discarded gloves. It was the grandest house I had ever set foot in, and from the first hour, Cordelia Vane made certain I understood I did not belong in it. She was never rude in a way you could name. That was her art. She would seat me at dinner and then remark, to no one, that some people had never learned which fork to use. She would have a dress made for me, and then sigh that it was a shame good cloth could not buy good breeding. She corrected my speech, my walk, the way I held my teacup. Every day was a small examination, and every day she waited for me to fail it and prove that I was what she believed me to be. A servant's child dressed up in a name she had spent her whole life keeping spotless. "In this house," she told me once, "blood is not enough. You need a name, and yours is borrowed." She did not know how close to the truth she had come. There was a whole grammar to her cruelty, and I learned to read it fluently that spring. When the good silver came out for Sunday dinner, my place was set with the plain, everyday forks, and if I noticed, I was proud. If I didn't, I was ignorant. When the dressmaker came, Cordelia would choose my fabric last and cheapest, and then lament aloud that some girls could not carry fine cloth no matter the cost. She would invite the ladies of her church circle to tea and introduce me with a pause before the word, "My brother's daughter," so that the pause said everything her manners forbade her mouth to say. I stood through all of it. I poured the tea correctly. I used the right fork the second time, having watched Stephen the first. Every small victory only made her hate me more, because a low-born girl who fumbled would have proved her right, and a low-born girl who did not was an insult she could not forgive. Because here is the thing I carried, the secret sewn into the lining of me. My mother was named Ruth Rowe. She was a seamstress, a widow, a quiet woman with clever hands who took in mending for the fine houses of Savannah. And one of those houses had belonged to Judge Everett Vane. I have to tell you this part, the way she told it to me, in the last month of her life, in a boarding house room that smelled of camphor and the medicine that wasn't working. I did not see it happen. I only heard her account of it, and later, I read the letters, and between the two, I have pieced together the truth. The judge had lost his wife young. My mother had lost her husband young. Two lonely people passed too many afternoons in the same quiet rooms, and something grew between them that neither one could carry into the daylight, because in that world, in that time, a widowed judge and a widowed seamstress could no more marry than the magnolia could marry the brick it fell on. It was tender. I believe that. It was also impossible, but I was not the judge's child. My mother had loved another man first. My true father was named Samuel Reed, a music teacher, poor as a church mouse, and frail his whole life long, a man who could coax heaven out of a piano and could not for the life of him keep a dollar or a lung sound. He had loved my mother, and she had loved him, and I was theirs. But Samuel was too poor and too sick to raise a daughter alone, and when my mother lay dying, it was Judge Vane, not out of duty but out of love for her, who made the promise. He would see me schooled. He would see me safe, and when he died, he would give me a name that no one could take away. Samuel Reed agreed to it. Can you imagine what that cost him? To hand his only child to another man's name so that she might have a future? He agreed to only one condition: letters, one from me, every month in secret for as long as he lived. I was not to visit openly. I was not to call him father where anyone could hear. But I was to write, and he was to write back, and in that thin thread of paper we would remain what we truly were. So when the will named me the judge's daughter, I knew it for the lie it was. A kind lie. A lie told to keep a promise to a dying woman, but a lie all the same. And I could not correct it, not without confessing that my mother had a lover before the judge, not without dragging her name and her memory through every parlor in Savannah, not without breaking the promise I had made to a poor sick man across town who was, at that very moment, waiting for my next letter. You see now the walls of my prison. The truth would have set me free. It would also have buried my mother a second time. I chose the walls. I might have borne it all. Cordelia's cruelty, the whispers, the loneliness of that great house, if it had not been for Stephen. He kept his distance at first, as a grieving son will, and I was grateful for it, because from the moment I met his eyes at the reading of the will, something in me had gone quiet and strange. But a house is a small world, and we could not avoid each other forever. We met in the library over the same books. We passed on the stairs. He found me one evening at the piano. I had not been able to help myself. My father's gift lived in my hands. And he stood in the doorway a long time before he said, "I didn't know you played." I stopped. I had almost said my father taught me. I taught myself, I said instead. Another lie. They were multiplying now, small ones spawned by the great one, the way they always do. We began to talk. Then to walk in the garden in the cool of the evening. Then to ride out along the marsh roads in the mornings before Cordelia woke. I want to tell you, it happened slowly. But the truth is that it happened all at once and took months to admit. I fell in love with Stephen Vane, and he, God help us both, fell in love with me. And he believed I was his sister. I will never forget the evening it broke open. We were in the garden, close under the magnolias, closer than a brother and sister ever stand, and I saw in his face that he was about to say something neither of us could take back. And then I watched him remember. I watched the horror cross him like a cloud over the sun. He stepped back so fast he nearly fell. "You're my sister, Helen," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "God forgive me. You're my sister." I could have ended it there. 3 words. He is not my father. I had them in my mouth. But behind those 3 words stood my dead mother's good name and my living father's last request, and I could not spend them. So I said nothing. I let the man I loved believe he was damned for loving me, and I turned and walked back into that house, and I have never in my life done anything harder. That was the shape of my days after that. Stephen tortured by a sin that did not exist. Me holding the cure and forbidden to give it. And once a week, on Thursdays, my secret errand, which was about to become the rope they hanged me with. Every Thursday I slipped out. I walked into the center of town to the post office, and then I went further, to a shabby boarding house on the poor side of Savannah, where Samuel Reed lived out his last months in a room barely bigger than his bed. My father. I brought him what I could, a little food, a book, the letters my mother had left. We had so little time, and we both knew it. His lungs were failing. Each Thursday he was thinner, grayer, his cough deeper. But he would take my hand in his musician's fingers and ask me to describe the magnolias, and for an hour we were simply a father and his daughter, which was all either of us had ever wanted to be. Those Thursdays were the only hours that whole year when I could breathe. In the Vane house, I was watched and weighed and found wanting from the moment I woke. But in that little room with the peeling wallpaper and the single window that looked out on a brick wall, I was nobody's disgrace and nobody's intruder. I was a daughter. Samuel would ask me to play for him. There was a battered upright in the boarding house parlor, 3 keys dead, and I would go down and play my mother's favorite hymns with 2 fingers avoiding the silent notes, and he would sit at the top of the stairs where he could hear, too weak to come down. And afterward, he'd say it was the finest concert in Georgia. We both knew we were running out of Thursdays. Neither of us ever said so. That was our own small mercy to each other. A servant from the Vane house saw me once, pressing an envelope into the hands of a thin, poor man on a mean little street. She did not hear a word we said. She only saw a young woman, The judge's shameful secret daughter, meeting a man in secret and giving him letters. By the end of the week, the whole house believed I had a lover. Dr. Cameron seized on it like a drowning man seizes a rope. You have to understand his position. His own daughter, Evelyn, was promised to Stephen. Their marriage was to join the two oldest families in Savannah, and I had dropped into the middle of it like a stone into still water. If I could be shown to be not merely low-born but disgraced, a girl carrying on with some ragged man across town, then I could be cast out, and the marriage his family had counted on could go forward. So the doctor had me followed, and one Thursday his man intercepted one of my letters before it reached the post. He read enough to damn me. He read the tender words, the promise to come again, the endearments a daughter writes to a beloved father. But he did not read them as a daughter's words, because it never entered his head that the thin, poor man could be anything but my lover. He carried the letter to Cordelia, and the two of them, who had never agreed on anything, agreed on this. I had to be exposed and thrown out of the house before the wedding. They finally had their proof against me. The only trouble was, the proof was true, and the sin was not. They confronted me in the front parlor, with Stephen standing by the cold fireplace so that he would see it with his own eyes. Cordelia held up the letter. Dr. Cameron named my crime. A secret man. Secret meetings. Secret letters. The judge's disgraceful daughter, disgracing them all. I did not deny the meetings. I could not, for they were real. I did not deny the letters. But I would not tell them who Samuel Reed was to me. Because to explain the letters, I would have to explain everything, and everything led back to my mother's grave and my father's dying wish, and those I would not surrender for my own comfort. Not even to save myself, not even for Stephen. He looked at me with his whole heart breaking in his eyes, and he said, I defended you against every soul in this house. I called you my sister, and I meant to protect you. Who is that man to you, Helen? Only tell me that, and I'll stand between you and all of them. And I said the truest thing I could without betraying the dead. He is someone I will not betray, I told him. Not even for you. I watched something close in Stephen's face. I had chosen a stranger over him, or so it seemed, and there is no wound quite like that one. He turned away. And I knew, standing in that beautiful cold room, that I would be leaving the Vane house, and that I would leave it disgraced, and that the man I loved would spend his life believing I had loved someone else. That should have been the end. It nearly was. But on the night before I was to go, the second man came to my door, the one who knew. Reverend Nathaniel Marsh was the third of the judge's old friends, the pastor who had married the Vanes and buried them, and the other man charged with settling the estate. He was 63, soft-spoken, with eyes that had heard too many confessions to be shocked by anything. He came to my room the night before my leaving and sat down like a man setting down a heavy case he'd carried a long way. I know you are not his daughter, he said. I could not speak. Everett told me, the Reverend went on, years ago in confidence. He told me about your mother. He told me about the music teacher. He told me the will he meant to write and why. It was the only way he could think of to keep his promise to a dying woman. To give you a name and a place and never let anyone know what your mother had been to him or what she had been to another man before him. He was a coward in life, Helen. He could not claim your mother while she lived. So he claimed you when he was dead. It was the bravest cowardly thing I ever knew a man to do. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in that whole terrible year, I was not alone with the truth. Then you know I could end all of this with a sentence, I said. I could tell Stephen. I could clear my name. Why do you think I haven't? And he looked at me with those tired, kind eyes and asked me plainly, Why haven't you, child? I gave him the answer that I have carried as the truest thing I ever said. Because the truth would free me, I told him, and bury my mother twice. The Reverend was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There may come a day when the truth can no longer hurt the dead. On that day, Helen, you must not let it keep hurting the living. Promise me." I did not promise. I did not know yet how soon that day would come. Because Thursday came, and I went to the boarding house one last time to say goodbye to my father before I left Savannah forever, and I found him dying. I will not describe it in detail. He would not have wanted that, a man so private about his own frailty. I will only tell you that I got there in time, which is more than I can say for so much else in my life. I sat with Samuel Reed through his last night, and I held his musician's hand, and I got to do the one thing that year had denied everyone else. I got to say goodbye. Near the end, he pressed into my hands a wooden box. Inside were all my mother's letters, and beneath them, in his own failing script, a note. I have it still. It is on my lap tonight with the rest. "Tell the truth when it can no longer hurt the dead," he had written. "The dead forgive. The living need you." My father died before the sun came up, and with him died the last person my mother's secret could wound. She was gone. He was gone. The judge was gone. There was no one left to bury a second time. The Reverend's words came back to me, and Samuel's. And for the first time, the truth in my keeping was not a weapon that would harm the dead. It was only a gift I had been too frightened to give the living. I went back to the Vane house one last time, and I told Stephen everything. I put my mother's letters in his hands. I told him who Samuel Reed was. I told him about the promise and the will, and the reason I had let him believe the worst of me rather than break faith with two people in their graves. And I watched relief and ruin cross his face in the same instant. Relief that he had not loved his sister, that there was no sin, that the year of torment had been built on nothing. And ruin, because I was leaving, because his family had disgraced me past mending, because he was a Vane and I was, still, a seamstress's child with a borrowed name. Evelyn was in the hall. She heard more than she was meant to. And that young woman, whom I had thought of as a rival, did the finest thing anyone did in that whole house. She came into the room, and she looked at Stephen, and she said, "I won't marry a man who looks at another woman the way you look at her. I deserve better than to be someone's duty." She set him free. She gave him back to himself. But Cordelia had one card left, and she played it. If Stephen went after me, a girl with no name and now no reputation, she would see to it that he lost everything. The Vane name, the Vane money, the house, the standing, all of it. She said it coldly, and she meant every word. And I watched Stephen Vane, who was good and kind and weak in the one way that mattered, hesitate. That hesitation cost us 50 years. I did not wait to see which way he would choose. I could not bear to. I took my father's box of letters, and I got on a train heading north, and I did not look back at Savannah, because there are some things a person cannot survive looking at. No one came after me. No one saved me. I want to be honest about that, because the stories always end with the man on the platform, breathless, calling the woman's name. Mine did not. The train pulled out, and I was alone. 19 years old, disgraced, with a wooden box on my knees and no idea in the world what would become of me. Here is what became of me. I became a music teacher. My father's gift, the one true inheritance I ever claimed, put bread on my table for 40 years. I went north, Philadelphia first, then a small town in Pennsylvania where nobody had ever heard of the Vanes, and I made a life out of almost nothing, one piano lesson at a time. The first years were hard in ways I will not dress up for you. I rented a room. I took in mending, the way my mother had, until the lessons were enough. I taught the doctor's children and the grocer's children and, in time, their children too. A whole town's worth of small hands learned their scales from me. and not one of those families ever knew that their prim piano teacher had once been the scandal of Savannah society. I found I preferred it that way. There is a kind of freedom in being no one's secret. I married, eventually, a good man, a kind man, a schoolteacher named Walter, who loved me steadily and asked no questions I couldn't answer. He knew there had been someone before, long ago, and he had the grace never to press. We had a quiet happiness for a while. We never had children. He died younger than he should have, of the same trouble in the heart that had taken the judge, and I mourned him honestly, and then I went on, because that is what you do. The wooden box came with me everywhere. Every house I lived in, it sat in the same place at the top of the closet. My mother's letters, my father's note, and folded in with them a copy of a will that had once claimed I was a daughter I never was. Now and then, over the years, word of Savannah reached me. Stephen had not married Evelyn. She had ended it, as she'd said she would. He'd married someone else in time, some suitable girl his aunt approved of, and been widowed, and grown old keeping up what was left of the Vane name in a world that cared less and less about such things. Cordelia died, Dr. Cameron died, the Reverend died. The whole cast of that terrible year went into the ground one by one, and I stayed north and grew gray and told no one my story. And then, in the spring of 2016, when I was 70 years old, a letter came. The handwriting was shaky, the hand of an old man. But I knew it. I had spent 1 year of my life memorizing every glance and gesture of the person who wrote it. The return address said, simply, S. Vane. Stephen had never quite let me go, it turned out, not in 1965, and not in all the years he was doing his duty by another woman, and least of all once that duty was finished and he was free. And when at last he found me, an old widow in a small house, teaching the neighborhood children their scales, he did not send flowers or make grand speeches. He sent a letter, because that was the language the two of us had always spoken best, though we never got to speak it to each other until then. The first line is on my lap tonight. I know it by heart. There is no will binding me now, he wrote, and no name worth more than yours. In the letter, he told me the rest of what I had missed. After I left, he had gone looking for me within the month. But I had vanished north with no forwarding address, a disgraced girl who did not want to be found, and in 1965, a person who did not wish to be found could stay lost for a lifetime. He had married, as duty and his aunt required, and been a decent husband to a woman he did not love the way he'd loved me, and he did not pretend otherwise, even in a letter written 50 years late. When his wife passed and his aunt was long dead and there was no one left to obey, he had spent his last years and no small part of what remained of the Vane money hiring men to find one music teacher in the whole wide North. It had taken him 9 years of searching. He wrote that he would have searched 90. He came north that summer, an old man, stooped, his dark hair gone white, but his eyes were the same eyes that had looked at me across a lawyer's office when we were young and cursed. We sat in my little garden and we talked for 6 hours, and we did not once mention the years we'd lost, because there is no use weeping over a river that has already reached the sea. We were married that autumn, Stephen and I, in a plain ceremony with no one there but a judge and 2 witnesses we'd met that morning. I was 70 years old. He was 75. There was no Vane fortune left to speak of, no aunt to forbid it, no family to please, no name worth more than a person. Just the two of us, finally, with nothing in the way at last, but the years. We had 9 years together. 9 good years, more than I ever thought this life owed me. He learned to garden. I played the piano for him in the evenings, my father's songs, and he would close his eyes and say he could hear a whole life in them. We did not talk much about Savannah. We had both spent enough time there. Stephen died last spring, here in this house, with his hand in mine. I got to say goodbye. After a lifetime of not being allowed to, I got to say goodbye to the 2 men I loved most, my father and my husband, and I have come to believe that this, and not the wedding or the will or any of it, is the mercy my life was really about. So tonight, I sit here with two things on my lap: a will and a bundle of letters. Judge Vane lied in his will to keep a promise. He gave me a false name so that I would have a true future, and he could not find the courage to tell that truth while he lived, only after he was safely dead. My father, Samuel Reed, told the truth in secret, in letters, and asked only that I keep it hidden until it could no longer wound the dead. One man lied out of love. One man told the truth out of love. And all my life I have wondered which of them loved me right. I think now that they both did. The judge gave me a place in the world. My father gave me myself. And between the borrowed name and the secret letters, a frightened girl of 19 grew into a woman who could sit alone at 80 and feel, at last, that she had been loved by more people than she ever knew. I kept the promise. It cost me 50 years with the only man I ever loved, and I have never once been certain I was right. So I will leave it with you, the way it was left with me. If you had been in my place, if the truth could save you but shame the mother in your grave, if a single sentence could free you but break a promise to the dying, what would you have done? Would you have spoken the truth? Or would you have kept the promise and paid for it as I did, with everything but your honor? I still don't know the answer. I only know which one I could live with. And in the end, I suppose that is the only answer any of us ever really has.